So the basic idea here, what Immanuel Kant came to understand is that from his examination of the nature of God and the nature of existence, he never said that God doesn't exist. What he ultimately said is we can't know with any certainty whatsoever that God exists, and we can't know anything about the true nature of reality at a metaphysical level. These are things that we cannot know. So that therefore means that we cannot use God and we cannot use nature in order to talk about morality. I had a moral principle, and my moral principle was that every time I tell a promise, I'm going to intend to break it. That's the principle I'm going to use with regards to promise keeping. So what Immanuel Kant would say is, okay, is that a good principle or a bad principle? Is it right or wrong? Universalize it. Well, what would it be like if every single person acted according to the same principle that you're acting towards? And using this process of just looking at the necessary structure of the mind, he thinks that we can ultimately get to what he calls the categorical imperative. And all that means is that every time we act, he says, in order to be rational, in order to recognize how our mind functions, we have to treat every single person with whom we are acting as if they are also capable of doing the same thing that we're capable of doing in terms of identifying universal laws. The language he puts it in is you treat everybody as an end and not only as a means, meaning that you never treat somebody only as a resource to get what you want. You always recognize in them the same capacity that you have. So this creates what are called moral boundaries among all individuals. Things that are right are things that are permissible. You're allowed to do it. Things that are wrong are things that are impermissible. You're not allowed to do it. So what the output of all this is that you can do literally whatever you want to do so long as it doesn't interfere with other people in such a way that you're using them just as a means to your desired goal. Now let me translate that into our contemporary language. Basically, how this eventually works its way into our culture is, as long as you have consent, do whatever you want. Literally, do whatever you want. The only mechanism for morality that we have is, do you consent? Do I consent? Do we consent? If we all consent, it's right. If we don't consent, it's wrong. So, this is a very, very powerful moral framework. And I would argue that it's basically what we operate on right now, this idea of consent. We don't talk about nature, we don't talk about metaphysics, we're certainly not talking about God, we talk about consent. So then the problem would be, well, is he right? I mean, did you just sort of ruin your own presentation here by extolling the virtues of Kant and saying that we can do this? No. So what are the problems? Well, the problem is we can start even at an individual level, because one of the great sort of virtues that oftentimes is attached to Kant is that he's freed us to be whoever we want to be. Because again, all that matters is that we don't interfere with the rights of others. As long as we're not doing that, we can literally do whatever we want to do. But then the question becomes, okay, so who am I? This moral theory says, it's totally silent. It gives you no guidance for what kind of person you should be outside of setting boundaries. Just don't cross this, don't cross this, don't cross this, don't cross this. But in this space, do whatever you want to do. And that may sound like wow, I'm liberated. But here's the problem. It's an anthropological problem. How do I know then what it is I'm supposed to be? Because once I go inside of myself and I look around and say, okay, self, who are you? Right? I'm going to see this, to import St. Augustine back into this, I'm not going to see this like one very clear self that's just been waiting to have his day in the sun. Here I am, it's me. It's a war inside of me, right? Who am I? Am I the gregarious self, or am I the reticent self? Am I the self that's outgoing, or the self that's shy? Am I the self that is generally pleasant to be around, or the self that sometimes is absolutely miserable? Am I the self that's angry? Am I the self that does the fake smiles, right? All of that is inside of me. So then the question is, well, which one am I? And this moral theory says, no guidance. So we don't actually know how to pattern ourselves according to a standard of what's good, bad, and right and wrong, because there isn't one. And we're kind of left in a kind of internal schizophrenia. It's a scary output here, even if you don't see it on the surface. The other issue here is that autonomy is a capacity. It's something you can do, which means that those who can do it, or those who have it, those are full persons. But what about people who don't? What about not only those who aren't born yet, but infants and babies and children, the infirm, those who have mental handicaps, other forms of handicap? Are they really humans anymore, according to this model? It's not clear. If you define your whole humanity based upon a capacity that you have, then it's not clear that you're still a human being if you don't have that capacity. Needless to say, that's dangerous. We can also say that reason itself, this goes back to some earlier lectures here, reason itself, it doesn't justify itself, remember? We can't explain why we have these ways of thinking. They just are. And so, in fact, in order to believe in reason, we have to have faith in reason, which means we're having faith in a kind of reality that's outside of reason, which also challenges Kant's theory. We also have the question of what prevents people from consenting to things that are very, very bad, or we typically think they're bad. We think that we live in a society where you can do whatever you want as long as you consent. But think of all the things that we still prohibit that otherwise people would say they want to do but can't do. Things like, for example, fighting to the death like they used to do in the Roman Colosseum. If we're truly a society of consent, we should allow people to do that. But what we're doing is we're importing these other values, these old Christian values that we used to have, and saying, well, no, there's some things you actually shouldn't consent to. But this doesn't have limits. This has no limits. You should be able to consent to anything. Finally, even if we can explain how this point of view commands you to do something, so even if we give Kant his day in the sun and say, look, you have a good explanation for why the mind does say, yes, you should or shouldn't do this. Then the question is, well, what motivates us, honestly? Why should I obey my reason? What's the point of obeying my reason, especially if it's totally disconnected from my anthropology or from my understanding of reality or my relationship with God? It's totally independent. So what's the point of this? So in sum, even if this view can do the command part of morality, it has a pretty hard time with the motivate part. So two more options. Option number 3 is to say that morality exists and can be deduced from nature. So now we have nature back on the board here. Nature's back in play, but not God yet. So what we're looking at here is a natural law approach to morality. And what we're saying from this perspective is that there is a fixed structure of reality. There's something called metaphysical necessity. And that metaphysical necessity, it provides the standard for morality. Things are a particular kind of way. And we can know that they're a particular kind of way. So now, unlike the previous model, we don't talk about right and wrong. We talk about good and bad. And what is good is that which is in accordance with the way things are. You're acting in accordance with reality as such. What is bad is when you're acting in such a way that violates the way things are. So let me give you a very sort of basic example here. Think about a healthy organ. Think about a healthy liver, for example. A liver operates in a particular kind of way. It has a particular kind of function. It has a goal. And what we would say is, well, what's good for the liver? What's good for the liver is what helps the liver to do what the liver is intended to do. That's what's good. What's bad for the liver? Well, what's bad for the liver is acting in such a way that you interfere with the right activity of the liver, preventing it from doing what it's already trying to do. Well, just use that liver example and imagine a full human being, right? Under this model, what it is to be a good human being is to recognize that we have a nature, and that nature has a particular goal, and what's good is that we help that nature to become and be itself. And then what's bad is to act in such a way so we actually like drinking too much alcohol and beginning to hurt our liver. Well, being immoral is like hurting your being, yourself. What this also has, and this is a very important feature of this argument, is that it helps us distinguish between what's natural and what occurs in nature. This is a confusion I see all the time. Just because something occurs in nature doesn't mean it's natural. To say something's natural means that it is in accordance with the way things are, that there are these patterns that structure reality, and to say, well, that's a natural thing to occur means that it's in line with those patterns. But we also know that sometimes there's exceptions, right? So, for example, it's natural for a human being to have 2 legs. But there are instances of human beings who are born who have 1 leg. So we don't say that it's natural, that those human beings are natural in the sense that they're just as natural as human beings have 2 legs. We say that's an aberration of nature. That's an exception. Now, if we don't have a standard of what's natural, then we can't say that this is normal and this is an aberration. We can't say that. We can just say it's different. This model gives us a standard so we can recognize what is actually natural and what's an aberration. Now, to be clear here, this has nothing to do with moral condemnation of people, for example, who are born with certain disabilities. It has nothing to do with that. It has to do with recognizing a standard and then deviations from that standard. This is also a crucial benefit of this theory. It recognizes that there are true standards, and so that gives us the possibility of saying, this is true, this is false. And then the motivation factor is this: acting in accordance with what's good leads to your happiness. So the reason you're moral is because it's good for you and because it will make you happy. Not just because it's your duty, but because it will make you happy. So here, command and motivation have been united. So now it looks like I've done it again. Well, then why do we need God if you just put this whole thing together right now? The problem is natural law theory doesn't make sense unless you locate it within some kind of conception of divinity. It can't sustain itself. So there's nothing wrong with the natural law framework in and of itself. The problem is when you try and cut it off from a conception of God. Because in order to have true principles in existence, those must be rooted in some kind of non-contingent truth itself, which gets us all the way back to where we started, and now again we're talking about God. So nothing wrong with this theory in and of itself, only when you sever it.
Do you want to fall in love with God? I'm sure we all want to. The book of Psalms contains the directions. Thousands of years ago, people like you and me talked to God out of the depths of their hearts, revealing an intimate love. Psalms are the expression of the faith in God by people around 3,000 years ago. God was not a mere abstract creator, but was present, involved, and a real person of power and emotions. Now, when we read or listen to the Psalms, we can know the intensity of this love. Entering into the influence of the Psalms, we can find a path to know and love God. To know more about the Psalms, you should get a copy of Father Mike Manning's booklet, The Psalms. It will help you to understand the 150 Psalms better as he has categorized them. He uses the technique of acts: adoration, contrition, thanksgiving, and supplication. Get your copy today and know the categories. Learn to pray with the Psalms.
Call the number on the screen or email us. You can also get it through our website. Get your copy today.
So let's get to the last one here. Morality exists and can be induced from nature. So again, here, instead of starting from a principle up here and then deducing it, we're just starting from observation. We're using induction. And what we're doing when we use induction is we're looking at lots of different particulars and then combining those particulars to create a general idea. So this is, as I said before, this is like using science to figure out what's good and bad and right and wrong. And it could take a form like this. So let's say I'm a biologist of some sort and I'm observing chimpanzee behavior. and I observe different groups or different troops of chimpanzees, and I see that some chimpanzees act this way and some chimpanzees act this way. And I note that the chimpanzees who cooperate with each other have a higher probability of surviving than the chimpanzees who war with each other. And so now I have this comparative data, and so I come to the conclusion that, well, actually cooperation leads to better survival. Better survival is good. We're kind of like chimpanzees, so therefore what's good is that we cooperate with each other. You see how that reasoning goes? Now I've just used observation to come to a conclusion. This is basically what evolutionary biologists try to do to squeeze out morality from evolution. They try and get it from evolutionary theory itself by saying, look, the ability or the desire to reproduce and the desire to stay alive, those in and of themselves are enough to explain all of the morality that we need, including altruism. So altruism is the idea we think that we have that, well, some people are self-giving. Some people will sacrifice for others. And the evolutionary biologists come along and say, yeah, you may think that altruism comes from this God of yours, but actually, evolutionary theory shows that within any given group, having a certain amount of people who are self-sacrificial helps the unity of the group and helps the health of the group, which helps protect it from external threats and helps those in the group to get their genes into the next gene pool. So voila, out of evolutionary theory, we now have Mother Teresa. Ta-da! Okay, seriously, they try and make that argument. It's not going to work. This is the last problem, and then we'll conclude. There's some methodological problems with this. First of all, morality requires some form of universality, meaning it has to be the same everywhere all the time. In order for it to be actually true morality, you can't get there by observation, right? There's no such thing as a universal observer except for God. So we just can't get there with this method. The other is that morality requires some kind of necessity. Remember, it has something that can be contradicted. But you can't get that. You can't get that inductively. Because when you look at any given population of humans, for example, you'll find, well, look, 95% of them will do this in this particular instance, and 5% will do this. Well, that 5% should cancel out the 95, right? You don't have a universal standard that you can apply to all human beings because there's all these different kinds of behaviors. So because of that, because there's no possibility of contradiction, you don't have a standard. You just have different kinds of behavior, different things that human beings do. You don't have one fixed standard that can either be acted in accordance with or violated, which means you can't distinguish between what's natural and just what occurs in nature. And another issue here is, why do we take it for granted that surviving is good or that getting our genes into the next gene pool is good? We just can't take that for granted. We have to justify that somehow. Evolutionary theory doesn't justify it. It just points it out. And finally, let me end with this example. So again, it's a serious argument. It's very present in our culture nowadays that we can use evolutionary theory to explain everything. But let me give you an example of what's called the sly nice guy. So based upon evolutionary theory, as I just described it, there's good reason to believe that some people will be nice, basically. They'll be compassionate, they'll be self-giving, and they'll be doing so. They may think that they're doing so because they think it's right and true and good, but actually it's evolution that's working through them that has genetically conditioned them in a kind of way to be nice and self-sacrificing. As a product of evolution, I can use these same impulses that I have to survive and get my genes to the next gene pool. So you can have a tyrant, an absolute nihilistic, murderous tyrant who is acting strictly according to evolutionary principles, and you can have someone like Mother Teresa. So this is what's called a contradictory moral theory. To say both people in both examples are doing the same thing, are both acting according to the right principles when they're opposites, means it's bunk. It doesn't work. You can't squeeze morality out of evolution. Which doesn't mean evolution doesn't have important things to teach us. It means you cannot get morality from it. So, what do we need then? In conclusion, we need a rational standard for morality that can be contradicted. Something fixed. We also need a rational standard that can be contradicted and also motivates us to act. And you know where we find that? A form of natural law that is grounded in the existence of God. The rational standard of natural law that's grounded in God's existence is God's existence. That creates the pattern, the right and the wrong, the good and the bad, that we can choose to pattern our lives according to or choose to deviate from. But it's there, it's fixed. And what motivates us is that when we act according to the standard of what's good, we become fully who we are. We become happy. We are as we are intended to be. We're like that happy little liver, right? Doing exactly what it was made to do. Well, that's us as a full organism when we act according to it. So there's the built-in motivation. So here's the point. That's exactly what Catholic morality has always taught. We've done a full circle here. We've gone through most of the history of thought and ended up exactly where what the church has always taught, which is that this is the only way to explain how we can have a coherent morality, is putting together all these different dimensions. So, to conclude, remember these arguments are not in and of themselves arguments for the existence of God. But first, if we believe that there is a self, if you actually think you're a self, then there's good reason to believe that you believe in God. Two, if you actually believe that there is such a thing as morality, then there's also good reason to believe that you are a believer in God. And finally, we have to ask ourselves, what ultimately is more rational? To believe that there is no morality, to believe that there is no self, that it's all just illusion? Is that ultimately, weighing all the evidence, the most rational position? Or is what the most rational position that, well, no, you do exist, I do exist, and right and wrong also exist? Meaning, we've gone through this great, great journey to come back right to where we are this evening, but now we can sit here with some peace and say, okay, what does appear to be common sense is in fact common sense. So, to be continued, and we'll be looking at some potential responses to some criticisms of all the arguments we're looking at from an atheistic perspective in the next lecture. Thanks so much for your time, and God bless you all.
Matthew,
Yes.
terminal lucidity.
Mm-hmm.
You spoke about that. There's so many things here. It's like, well, consent, autonomy, on and on.
I know
and
it's-
on.
I know
Okay,
it's
I want that. Okay, I like this. Well, terminal lucidity. I kind of identified with that because I've experienced sitting with people at the time of death. My mother and my mother-in-law. Because you're a believer in God, when they speak about so and so is in the room, move over, so because so and so's they want to come closer, or the person starts talking about things that whoever is visiting them in there. And be sure you do this, and be sure you do that, and don't do this to so-and-so. That's not right. And you know your mother is on her way out, and she's dying, but she's talking about things that, lo and behold, came to pass. And to me, because I'm a believer, I see that as God is speaking through her, or he wants us to know something, or
Yeah.
I'm not sure what it is, because like in this course, it's just to me more of a critical thinking course, than, it, puts you in a, okay, well, how can that be if, but anyway, but then you'll have a doctor come in and burst your bubble and say, no, that's not possible. It's what it is they're experiencing. I'm just going to
Lack of oxygen to the brain
or
is what they
something
say,
like
yeah.
that. Yeah. Now I think I would know to say, no, I believe that God is here. But why do you think that doctors do this? Why don't they? Do you think it's just a fear of saying you're a believer, that you believe? Because that does happen.
I think if you were to ask most people, maybe not all people, but most people, you live long enough, there's things that happen to you that are just completely inexplicable by using quote-unquote natural phenomena to explain them. The basic cause and effect relationships you see on how this leads to this leads, and then there's miracles. So I think the question is when we accept the reality of God, when we accept when we take a miracle and then look at what the miracle points to, which is the reality of the supernatural, and that all that we think that we believe about heaven and the angels and the flip side, the demons, that all of that is in fact real, that's going to lead to a radical change in our lives. And here I'll draw on St. Augustine again, who had this long, tortuous conversion, which is that if we really commit ourselves to the truth that we already deep down know, we're not going to be able to be the same people as before. And we're comfortable, to some degree, being the same people. We're comfortable with our sin. Remember, sin would not be a problem if it weren't in some way pleasant, in some way had the power to hold us, right? If sin were ugly and smelly and scary, we wouldn't be sinners. So there's something about sin that's enticing, and so enticing that we're actually scared to lose it. It's like the addict who's scared of becoming clean. Even though they hate their addiction, they're terrified of what life will be like without their addiction because they're used to their addiction. So if we actually believe in God, then I can't go on living the way that I used to live because now I know I'm responsible. And I think a lot of it, and I'm speaking from experience here, a lot of it is if you cross that line, there's no coming back. And that means you're responsible for your soul, nobody else. You can't pin it on society or your childhood or your mom or whatever. It's you now. And that's scary. But it also means that a lot of people choose to stay addicted rather than to get clean.
Since you said that sin is pleasant, so you mean that God is allowing us to experience sin?
Yeah. We're allowing ourselves. That's one of the, it's not the only explanation, of course, but one of the best explanations for understanding why the world is the way it is, including our small worlds that we create in our own lives and around us, is that God respects our freedom. And that includes the freedom to destroy ourselves and destroy each other. Why? Because the same freedom that can be used to destroy is the same freedom that can be used to love. It's the same freedom. And so we can't, if we substitute that freedom with somebody else, we also eradicate love, the possibility of love. We are free. We don't need to sin, but we do. And so life is unnecessarily difficult because of it. So thank you all.